Hello everyone, I'm Sophie, and today I want to share with you a story that I think everyone has experienced at least once in their life. A moment full of emotions, changing everything. When we face decisions that can never be undone. Would you dare to step beyond the boundaries of safety to find something truly meaningful? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any other inspiring stories. Let's dive into today's story. It was an ordinary evening, one of those where the sunset paints the sky in soft, muted hues and everything seems peaceful. I was at home, unwinding after a long day, when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The name on the screen caught my attention, Ben, my childhood friend. I hadn't heard from him in years, not since those carefree days in college when we would hang out, laugh about silly things, and share our dreams of the future. But this wasn't Ben calling. This time, it was his younger brother, Josh. I froze for a moment, confused. Josh was still a teenager the last time I saw him. I hadn't seen him grow into a young adult, and frankly, I had no idea what he was up to. I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling slightly. I hadn't even realized how much time had passed until now. "Hey Josh, it's been forever. What's up?" I greeted, trying to mask the surprise in my voice. He responded with a deep, almost unfamiliar voice. "Hey, Sophie. I hope this doesn't sound too strange, but I need a favor." I paused. His voice was shaky, almost hesitant. Something was off, and I couldn't quite place it. "Sure, what's going on?" There was a long pause before Josh spoke again. "Can I come over?" "I don't want to do this over the phone." His words left me uneasy, like there was something important, something serious he needed to discuss. I glanced at the clock. It wasn't too late, around 7:30 p.m., but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. "Okay, come over." "I'll be here," I replied, trying to sound calm, though inside I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. The moment the doorbell rang, I felt my heart skip a beat. There was something about the sound, sharp and sudden, that made everything else around me fade into the background. My hands trembled slightly as I stood up from the kitchen counter. I wasn't sure what to expect, but a strange mix of anticipation and dread settled into my chest. This was no ordinary visit. When I opened the door, there stood Josh. For a moment, I barely recognized him. He was taller than I remembered, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he stood there, unsure of how to enter. His hair was messy, the dark locks falling just the right way to give him an effortlessly cool look, and his jawline had become more defined, sharper. The awkward teenager I once knew had transformed into a young man, a man who seemed more mature, more certain of himself. "Hey, Sophie," he greeted quietly, his voice deeper than I remembered, almost as though he was trying to soften the air between us. He stepped inside, his movements slow, like he was unsure of how to act. The tension in his posture didn't go unnoticed. His shoulders were a little too stiff, his eyes flickering around the room as if he was searching for something to settle on. I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in him. The way his eyes roamed the room, almost searching for something more, as if they were studying everything and nothing at once. It was as if he was no longer the carefree kid who trailed behind us years ago, but a person carrying something heavy within. "You want something to drink?" I asked, my voice slightly strained, trying to break the silence that had formed between us. My attempt to ease the tension fell flat, but I wasn't sure how else to act. I had no idea what was coming next. "No thanks," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd seen him do when he was younger. He didn't meet my eyes right away, his gaze drifting down to the floor as if searching for the right words. "I appreciate you letting me come over," he added quietly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. There was a vulnerability in his tone, something raw that I hadn't expected from him. I stepped aside and gestured for him to sit. "So, what's this about?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. "You're being kind of cryptic." Josh took a deep breath, and I noticed his fingers nervously tapping against his thighs, as if he were trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. He seemed lost for a moment, as if the words he was about to say were tangled in his throat, stuck in the web of his thoughts. I waited patiently, unsure of what to say. But I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. This wasn't just a casual visit. Something important, something life-changing, was coming. I need advice, he finally said. His voice barely above a whisper, his words laced with a quiet desperation. I don't really know who else to turn to. The way he spoke, as if he was exposing something intimate and personal, made my heart ache. This was more than just a request. It was a plea, an unspoken cry for help. I need a woman's perspective. My brow furrowed. I couldn't hide my surprise, though I tried to mask it. A woman's perspective? I repeated, my curiosity piqued, my mind racing to keep up with the sudden shift in the conversation. He hesitated again, visibly uncomfortable with where the conversation was headed. I could see the discomfort flickering in his eyes as he took a moment to collect himself. Finally, he let out a breath and spoke. His voice a little more uncertain than before, but still filled with determination. I've never been with anyone before, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. Almost like he wanted to get them off his chest as quickly as possible. And I don't want my first time to be just some random, meaningless thing. The silence between us deepened. The words hanging in the air, heavy and filled with meaning. I want it to be real, he added softly, his gaze lifting to meet mine. I sat there frozen. His words hit me harder than I anticipated, each one piercing through me. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, the weight of what he was asking settling heavily on my chest. The air around us seemed to thicken, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to react. How could I? He wasn't asking for advice on something simple, something casual. This was something deeper, something personal. Something that made my entire body feel like it was suspended in a moment of uncertainty. It wasn't just the request itself that left me stunned. It was the way he said it, with such raw sincerity. The earnestness in his eyes. The way he looked at me, as though I were the only person in the world who could understand. There was no arrogance, no joking, it was just vulnerability. A kind of openness I didn't know Josh had in him. A strange warmth spread through me, something I wasn't expecting. I couldn't quite place it, but it was there, something that stirred inside me. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. And in that moment, I realized that Josh was no longer a kid to me. He wasn't just Lisa's little brother anymore. He was a man, standing before me, asking for something important, something that could change everything. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was a turning point. Josh, this is a lot to ask, I finally said, my voice trembling slightly as the weight of his words settled into my chest. I hadn't expected this. I'd anticipated many things during our conversation. But not this. Not this. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with unspoken tension. I wasn't sure how to process what he was saying or how to even begin responding to it. It wasn't just a question, it was a confession, a raw plea for guidance from someone who clearly wasn't ready to face this alone. His eyes, wide and searching, were filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen in him before. There was no bravado, no teenage arrogance. There was only sincerity, a desperation that made my heart tighten. It was as if he'd already made up his mind that I was the only person he could turn to. He nodded quickly, his gaze intense. Yeah, I do. You're the only person I can ask, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I don't want it to be a mistake. I don't want this to be something I'll regret forever. His words cut through me like a knife. But I could hear the pleading in his voice, the rawness of his fear. This wasn't just some casual question. This was everything to him. And he had placed that trust in me. I blinked, trying to grasp the magnitude of his words. The weight of what he was asking was suffocating. My mind raced as I processed everything, but the more I thought about it, the more the reality of the situation settled in. I couldn't just brush this off. I couldn't just pretend that this was a simple conversation about something trivial. No, this was about something fundamental. Something that would change the course of his life. and maybe even mine. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the space between us thick with the gravity of the situation. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat echoing loudly in my ears. I wasn't sure if it was fear, confusion, or something else entirely. But I could feel it, a storm of emotions, all swirling inside me. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but nothing felt right. The words were stuck, trapped in my throat. This wasn't the kind of conversation I had ever imagined having. And yet, here we were. His eyes never left mine, his expression pleading, vulnerable, raw. I wasn't a kid anymore. I wasn't the woman I had been in my 20s, someone who lived for everyone else, always concerned about what they needed, what they wanted, never stopping to think about myself. The woman I had become was someone who had buried her own desires, her own needs, in favor of others. But in this moment, as I stood there facing Josh, something inside me stirred. It was faint at first, just a whisper of a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge in years. And yet, there it was, unmistakable, a desire, a longing that I thought had long since disappeared. I could feel the walls I'd carefully built around my heart start to crack. I'd spent so many years suppressing everything, avoiding anything that might stir feelings of longing or desire. I had convinced myself that those parts of me were gone, buried beneath the weight of responsibility, of routine, of years spent in a world where everyone's needs came before my own. But Josh, in his raw honesty, had awakened something in me that I didn't know I was still capable of feeling. It was almost too much to bear, this sudden flood of emotions. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the warmth spreading through my veins, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was alive. Really alive. Not just going through the motions, but truly present in the moment, caught in the whirlwind of a decision I wasn't sure I was ready to make. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. I wanted to tell him that this wasn't something I could do, that there were lines we couldn't cross, but the words felt empty. How could I tell him that when a part of me wanted to reach out, to touch him, to acknowledge the deep connection between us that had always been there, buried beneath years of casual encounters? He was still waiting, his eyes wide, full of expectation. The intensity of his gaze burned through me, forcing me to confront something deep inside me that I had buried so carefully. I realized, in that moment, that maybe I wasn't as far removed from the girl I once was, the girl who could still feel love, desire, yearning. Maybe I was just afraid of letting myself feel it again. "Josh," I said, my voice softer now, barely above a whisper, "This is big. This is serious. I don't want you to regret anything." I didn't know if I was trying to convince him or myself. But I can't decide for you. I can only tell you that you deserve something real. Something that feels right. My hands trembled as I spoke, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence between us deepened. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next would change everything. And deep down, a part of me wondered if I was ready for that change. As I sat down on the edge of the couch, I ran my hands over my knees, trying to steady my breath. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel my pulse racing beneath my skin. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, conflicting emotions that I didn't know how to manage. How could I even begin to process this? How could I reconcile what I had just heard with what I knew about myself, about him, about us? Josh was still standing across from me, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. His posture was rigid, his body tense, as though he was holding onto something inside him, something that needed to be released. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, but I could see them trembling ever so slightly. He wasn't asking for anything more than reassurance, a validation that what he was about to ask wasn't wrong. And it was killing him. The silence between us, the uncertainty in the air. His words echoed in my mind. I want it to be real. I don't want it to be rushed. I could feel the sincerity in his voice. The weight of his desire for something meaningful. It wasn't about lust, about the thrill of something new and forbidden. It was about connection. About finding something real in a world that often felt shallow and fleeting. And it was that sincerity that cut through all my defenses, leaving me raw, exposed, and unable to ignore the pull I felt toward him. I looked up at him, my gaze meeting his, and for the first time in years, I saw him clearly, not just as Lisa's little brother, but as someone who had grown into a man, someone who had experienced his own struggles, his own questions about love and life. I realized how much he had changed, not just physically but emotionally. The boy I had once known was now standing before me, vulnerable and open, asking for something that I wasn't sure I was capable of giving. And I wondered, in that moment, if I was as ready for this as he seemed to be. "You know, Josh," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, "you could be with someone your own age. Someone who's just as new to all of this as you are." I wanted to offer him a way out, a safe path that wouldn't lead to this dangerous territory we were stepping into. I thought that maybe, just maybe, it would make this easier, less complicated. But his jaw clenched, and for the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of something fierce in his eyes, something I hadn't expected. Determination. "I don't want that," he said firmly, his voice steady, unwavering. "I don't want something awkward. I want something real. With you, Sophie." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, filled with an intensity that both terrified and thrilled me. "You've always been different. You never brushed me off like everyone else did." The room seemed to close in around us, the distance between us shrinking with every word. I felt my heart race, my mind reeling with the weight of his confession. I had never considered this possibility. I had never thought about the connection between us in this way. How could I have? He was just a kid, just Lisa's little brother. But his words struck a chord deep within me, reverberating through every part of me that I had tried to bury for so long. And then it hit me. What had I been running from? What was it that made me so afraid to face this? To confront the truth that had always been there, lingering beneath the surface? He was asking for something real, something that meant more than the shallow connections I had settled for in the past. And I realized, in that moment, that I had been running from myself, running from the possibility of truly feeling, truly living. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words, of his gaze, left me speechless. I had no answer for him, not yet. But I could feel something shifting inside me. The walls I had carefully constructed over the years, the barriers I had put in place to protect myself, were beginning to crumble. And deep down, I wondered if I was ready for what was coming next. Josh stood there, still waiting, still watching me with that unwavering intensity. His eyes were locked on mine, filled with hope, with trust, with a kind of raw honesty that made my heart ache. He wasn't asking for permission. Not exactly. He was asking for understanding, for me to see him, to see us, in a way that I hadn't been willing to before. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever happened next would change everything. For both of us. My heart raced, each beat thundering in my chest as a whirlwind of confusion, longing, and desire swirled inside me. Josh's gaze, those eyes filled with an intensity one couldn't look away from, seemed to erase all the years that had separated us. Time felt like it stood still, every moment stretched infinitely. And for the first time in so long, I wasn't worried about what came next. I wasn't worried about consequences. I wasn't thinking about the past or the future. All that existed in this moment was him and the undeniable pull between us. I had lived through so many things, but in that instant, it felt as though I had awakened from a long, restless sleep. My senses were heightened, every nerve in my body alive, tingling with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. I had pushed so much of myself away, locked it all up for fear of what might happen if I truly let myself feel. But standing there, facing Josh, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I felt it, a hunger, a craving for something real. For connection, for passion that I hadn't allowed myself to want. I stood up, my legs slightly unsteady beneath me, and for a brief second, I wondered if I was doing the right thing. My body trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. This wasn't a moment I could walk away from. This was a crossroads. I had to choose, and for once in my life, I wasn't afraid to make the choice. "Josh, this would change everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the words coming out shaky but steady, as though I was trying to convince myself as much as I was telling him the truth. The weight of what we were about to do hung in the air between us, thick and tangible. "I know," he replied without hesitation. His voice was firm, yet there was a softness in it, as though he, too, was feeling the magnitude of the moment. "But I'm okay with that. Are you?" For a brief moment, I hesitated. My mind screamed at me to stop, to step back, to close the door on this before it went any further. It would be easy to walk away now, to pretend nothing had happened, to avoid the consequences of what this might mean. My instincts, the years of responsibility, of playing it safe, all told me to pull away. But my heart, my very soul, was telling me something different. As Josh stepped closer, the space between us shrinking with each movement, I could feel the magnetic pull of him, his presence, his energy. Everything about him that called to me in a way I hadn't felt in ages. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to see into me, to strip away every facade I had carefully constructed. It wasn't just about attraction. It was the way he made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible, like someone was finally seeing me for who I was. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and every inch of space between us seemed to disappear. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could almost taste the electricity in the air, the tension that was palpable. And in that moment, I knew that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of temptation. This was something more, something deeper. "I've made my decision," I whispered, my voice trembling ever so slightly, my fingers reaching out to brush against his hand. The contact was so simple, so small, but it felt like an explosion. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a shock of electricity up my arm, and I could feel the sudden hitch in his breath as he froze. His body tensed, every muscle tight as if he were holding himself back, but he didn't pull away. For a moment, neither of us moved. We stood there, hands lightly touching, breaths mingling in the heavy silence. The world outside seemed to fade away as I looked up into his eyes. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, whatever this would become, we had already crossed a line. I wasn't sure what the future held, wasn't sure where this path would lead us. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel scared. I felt alive. And I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't walking away from this. Time seemed to stand still as we stood there, hands touching, eyes locked. The space between us was electric, charged with anticipation and something deeper, something more powerful than either of us had prepared for. I could feel my breath quickening, my pulse pounding in my ears as I looked at him, his gaze so intense that it felt like he could see right through me. Everything else faded away. The world, the consequences, the questions, none of it mattered in this moment. I leaned in slowly, my body trembling just slightly as I closed the distance between us. The first brush of my lips against his was gentle, almost tentative, as though we were both testing the waters, unsure of how far to go, uncertain if this was really happening. But the moment our lips met, it felt like a spark ignited, something deep and undeniable. It wasn't just a kiss. It was everything that had been building up between us, all the tension, all the longing, all the things left unsaid. My heart seemed to beat in sync with his, each pulse sending a jolt of heat through my body. His lips were soft but firm, his breath warm against my skin. At first, there was hesitation. He was uncertain, unsure of what was happening, of what it meant. But as the seconds stretched into eternity, I felt him relax, his body giving into the moment. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more intense, as though both of us were trying to make up for lost time, to make up for everything we had been holding back. I could feel his hands move, slow at first, but then with increasing confidence. His fingers found my waist, pulling me closer, pressing me against him as if he couldn't bear the distance any longer. His body was warm, solid, and as he held me, I realized something profound. I wasn't just kissing a young man who needed guidance. No, This was something far deeper than that. I was kissing someone who had awakened a part of me I thought was long gone, a part of me that I had locked away, convinced it was too dangerous to feel. But in that moment, as he pulled me closer, I couldn't deny it anymore. I wasn't just a guide to him. I was a woman, a person who had her own desires, her own needs, her own capacity to love, to want. And Josh, in his rawness, in his openness, had pulled that part of me to the surface. I couldn't escape it, and I didn't want to. This kiss, this moment, was more than just an expression of desire. It was a revelation. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, the world seemed to come rushing back, but it felt distant, like we were still suspended in that fragile moment. My chest rose and fell with each breath, my lips still tingling from the contact. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, searching for something, anything, that might explain the whirlwind of emotions inside me. His eyes were wide, filled with something between awe and uncertainty. "Did I do it right?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, as if he were unsure whether he had crossed some unspoken boundary, as if this moment, this kiss, was as new to him as it was to me. I smiled softly, a mix of tenderness and something else, something deeper, filling me. I reached up, my fingers brushing lightly against his jaw, the skin there warm and soft beneath my touch. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like everything. "Perfectly," I whispered, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. It was the truth. The kiss had been perfect, not because it was flawless or smooth, but because it was real. Because it was the culmination of everything we had both been too afraid to admit. I could feel the air between us shift, the tension, the anticipation. Now replaced by something else, something unspoken, something that bound us together in that quiet, fragile moment. Whatever happened next, I knew, things would never be the same. But for now, in the afterglow of that kiss, there was only one truth. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As we pulled apart, our breaths mingled in the quiet stillness between us. The room felt smaller now, more intimate, as if the air itself was charged with the rawness of what had just transpired. My heart was still racing, my body humming with the aftershocks of the kiss. His presence was overwhelming, like a magnetic force pulling me closer, and I couldn't help but feel the heat between us, the undeniable pull that had always been there. I took a slow breath, my fingers still resting gently on his jaw, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath them. His eyes were wide, but there was something else there now, something deeper, something more vulnerable. It was as if, in that kiss, he had opened up a part of himself he hadn't known existed, just as I had. Without saying a word, Josh stepped forward, closing the distance between us again. His hands found my waist, but this time there was no hesitation in his touch. His fingers slid around me, pulling me toward him as if he couldn't stand the space that remained between us. And I let him. There was something about the way he held me, the way his arms enveloped me, that made everything else fade away. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, the steady beat of his heart matching mine, and in that moment, I knew we weren't just two people who had shared a kiss. We were something more, two souls, intertwined in a way that defied explanation. My breath hitched as I felt his lips trail down my neck, soft at first, then with a hunger that mirrored my own. Every kiss, every touch, felt like a silent promise, an unspoken understanding that this was real, this was happening. I let myself surrender to it, to him, as his hands roamed down my back, pulling me closer still. His warmth seeping into me. It wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about connection. It was about feeling seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in so long. And in that moment, as Josh's lips found mine again, I realized that everything I had been afraid of, the consequences, the doubts, the fears, had melted away. All that mattered was the here and now. The way he made me feel, the way he made me feel alive in a way that I hadn't in years. We paused, faces inches apart, the air between us thick with desire, but also something more tender. Something that spoke to a deeper need. I looked up at him, my hand resting against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under my palm. He looked back at me, his eyes dark, filled with something fierce and caring, a mix of longing and tenderness that I couldn't quite place. Without a word, I kissed him again. This time, it wasn't tentative. It was urgent, but also filled with a tenderness that made my chest ache. His arms tightened around me, his body pressing me closer, and I could feel the heat between us, the desire that had been building since the first moment we touched. In that kiss, I felt everything, every unspoken word, every feeling that had been buried deep inside me, came rushing to the surface. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. The way he kissed me, the way he held me, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about a fleeting moment or a simple desire. This was real. This was us, fully connected, fully alive, together in a way that I had never allowed myself to be before. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, I rested my forehead against his, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. His hands gently cupped my face, as if afraid I might slip away. And I could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest as we both tried to regain our breath. "I've never felt anything like this," he whispered, his voice low, filled with awe and something deeper. His fingers brushed along my jawline, and I could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the same vulnerability I had seen before, but now there was a sense of peace in it. I smiled softly, my thumb tracing the outline of his lips, still tasting the kiss that had sealed everything between us. "Me neither," I whispered back, my voice full of emotion. "But it's real. It's happening." And as I leaned in once more, this time with no reservations, no doubts, I knew that whatever came next, we had both crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But in that moment, neither of us wanted to. The morning light crept through the curtains, soft and golden, painting the room in a warm, hazy glow. It was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions that had been swirling in my mind just hours before. I sat on the edge of the bed, my body still feeling the remnants of what had happened. The heat of the night that had already begun to fade into memory. My eyes were fixed on the window, but I wasn't really seeing anything. My thoughts were miles away, still tangled in the events that had unfolded in that small space between us. Josh had left quietly, just as quietly as he had entered. His goodbye had been gentle, almost reluctant, as if he, too, was unsure how to end this chapter we had written together. The lingering glance he had given me as he stepped out the door said more than any words ever could. There was no rush, no urgency to leave. Just a momentary pause, a silent understanding between us that said we both knew what had just happened was significant, that it mattered. But as the door clicked shut behind him, I was left with an overwhelming silence. I had expected to feel regret, to feel guilty or ashamed of what we had done, but strangely, I didn't. I thought that the weight of my decision, the enormity of what had just transpired, would settle on me like a heavy cloak. But it didn't. There was no crushing wave of shame, no rush of doubt. Instead, there was peace. A quiet kind of peace that washed over me, easing the tightness in my chest. It wasn't a mistake, I realized. It wasn't reckless. What had happened between Josh and me was real. It was raw and unplanned, but it was undeniably ours. Two people, choosing each other in that moment, for reasons neither of us could fully explain, but both of us knew were true. The fear, the uncertainty that had held me back for so long, had dissipated in the wake of that kiss, in the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was living in the shadows of my past or my responsibilities. I felt like I had made a choice that was mine to make, and that, somehow, felt more freeing than anything else. I had spent so much of my life trying to plan every step, trying to control every situation, to anticipate what might happen next, to avoid regret. But now, sitting in the quiet aftermath of what had transpired, I realized how much I had been missing. Life wasn't about perfecting every moment, about ensuring every choice was the right one. It wasn't about trying to predict every outcome or worrying about the consequences before even making a decision. Sometimes, life was simply about allowing yourself to feel, to live in the moment. without overthinking it, without second-guessing yourself. In the stillness of the room, I could almost feel the weight of the past slipping away. It was as though everything I had feared about myself, about this situation, had been lifted, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was freedom. Maybe it was acceptance. Or perhaps it was simply the understanding that sometimes the most meaningful moments in life come when we stop trying to control them, when we stop holding ourselves back. I wasn't sure what would come next, or where this would lead us. I didn't know if Josh and I would ever talk about this again, or if it was something we would leave behind. A fleeting moment that was only meant to be remembered by the two of us. But whatever happened, I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't a mistake. And that knowledge, that truth, settled in my heart like a quiet reassurance. It wasn't just a moment of passion. It was something more, a moment of connection that was ours to hold, and no one else's to define. As I stood up, I walked to the window and looked out, the sunlight filling the room with warmth, just as it had filled me in that moment. I felt like I had woken up from a long, deep sleep. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to face what came next. Life wasn't about planning every step, wasn't about controlling every detail. Sometimes, it was about allowing yourself to truly live, to choose you, to choose what feels right in your heart, no matter how complicated or uncertain it might seem. And with that realization, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it. I'd love to hear what you think. Feel free to leave a comment sharing your thoughts or any reflections you have on the story. Your feedback means a lot. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Thank you for being part of this journey, and I can't wait to share more with you.